The cruelest chains are never made of iron. They are forged when people decide another human being has a price. The blood moon hung low above Silver Ridge like a glowing crimson lantern, bathing the village square in a strange red light that made every face seem colder than usual. Evelyn Carter stood at the center of the wooden platform with her hands folded tightly in front of her worn gray dress, trying to ignore the whispers floating through the restless crowd. She was 22 years old, an Omega whose gentle heart had never been enough in a world that measured worth through strength, status, and powerful bloodlines. Tonight, she wasn't standing there as a daughter or even as a member of the pack. She was standing there as payment. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine trees and fresh rain through the valley, but it couldn't wash away the heavy silence settling over the gathering. Her stepfather, Harold Briggs, adjusted his expensive fur cloak before unfolding a parchment stamped with the silver seal of an allied pack. His voice rang confidently across the square. 3 wagons of grain, 2 wagons of winter supplies, 12 gold sovereigns. In return, the Omega known as Evelyn Carter. A few heads nodded in quiet approval. Others simply looked away. No one questioned the bargain. No one stepped forward. Evelyn lowered her eyes, not because she believed she deserved this, but because she had learned long ago that arguing only made people harder. Since her mother had passed away years before, every sunrise had become another reminder that kindness could be mistaken for weakness. She cooked, cleaned, cared for the elderly, soothed frightened wolf pups during storms, and never asked for recognition. Yet none of those things appeared on the parchment now resting in Harold's hands. There was only her name, reduced to another line beside livestock, supplies, and debts. Across the square, the representatives from Black Hollow Pack examined her with polite indifference, as though deciding whether an old piece of furniture was worth hauling home. One of them gave a satisfied nod before signing the agreement. Harold smiled wider than Evelyn had seen in years. The ink had barely dried before someone quietly removed the Carter family pendant from around Evelyn's neck. "That belongs to this pack," an elder murmured without meeting her eyes. The cool chain slipped away, leaving only empty skin where the last memory of her mother had rested. She closed her fingers, resisting the urge to reach for something that was already gone. The crowd slowly dispersed, speaking instead about the coming harvest, the approaching winter, and the exciting royal gathering only days away, where Alpha King Lucian Ashford was rumored to choose a Luna before every major pack in the Northern Territories. To them, Evelyn's trade was already yesterday's news. She stepped down from the platform carrying nothing except a small canvas satchel filled with 2 dresses, a faded blanket, and a tiny wooden carving of a wolf her mother had made when she was a little girl. Behind her, laughter returned to the square as merchants reopened their stalls. Life continued exactly as before, as though a human heart had not just been weighed against wagons of grain. High above the village rooftops, hidden beneath the shadow of an ancient oak overlooking the square, a tall man dressed in a plain black traveling cloak remained perfectly still. His silver eyes never left Evelyn as she disappeared into the narrow road leading toward Black Hollow. He said nothing. He revealed nothing. But beneath the quiet folds of his cloak rested the unmistakable crest of the royal house, concealed from every eye except the moon itself. The road to Black Hollow stretched for nearly 18 miles through forests that had already surrendered to autumn, their golden leaves drifting silently across the narrow dirt path as Evelyn Carter rode in the back of a supply wagon beside sacks of grain that seemed to hold more value than she did. No one spoke to her during the journey unless they needed something carried or sorted. By sunset, the towering wooden gates of Black Hollow rose before them, surrounded by sturdy stone walls and watchtowers where guards observed every newcomer with practiced indifference. As soon as the wagons rolled through the entrance, one of the overseers glanced toward Evelyn and pointed toward a weathered stable tucked behind the main gathering hall. "That is where you will sleep." His voice was neither angry nor kind. It was simply matter of fact, as though assigning a place for another tool in storage. Evelyn quietly thanked him, surprising the older man enough that he hesitated before walking away. The stable smelled of fresh hay, cedar wood, and horses settling in for the night. Compared to the cold roads outside, it was warm enough. She folded her faded blanket across a clean pile of straw, placed her small satchel beside it, and carefully rested the tiny wooden wolf where the moonlight slipped through a narrow window. It was still home to her, even if nowhere else was. Before sunrise the next morning, She was already sweeping the courtyard while the rest of the pack slowly awakened. By breakfast she had helped prepare bread, carried buckets from the well, cleaned the dining hall, and comforted a frightened stable colt that refused to eat after being separated from its mother. The young animal calmed the moment Evelyn gently rested her hand against its neck. One of the stable workers noticed but simply shrugged. To them, soothing frightened creatures was ordinary Omega work, hardly worth mentioning. Days blended together with quiet rhythm. Every assignment ended with another one waiting. Laundry, cooking, gathering herbs, repairing torn blankets, caring for elderly pack members whose own families rarely visited. Evelyn never complained. She simply offered the same gentle smile she had carried her entire life, even when no one returned it. Yet one habit inside Black Hollow never changed. No one called her by her name. 3 wagons, someone shouted whenever they needed her to fetch supplies. 3 wagons, clean the kitchen. 3 wagons, bring more firewood. 3 wagons, hurry up. At first she believed they would eventually remember her real name. After a week, she understood the nickname was intentional. It reminded everyone that she had arrived through a trade agreement, not by choice. Every time she heard it, she quietly repeated her real name inside her heart. Evelyn Carter. My mother chose that name, because she said it meant hope. I will not forget it. One chilly afternoon she noticed an elderly gardener struggling to carry 2 heavy baskets filled with late-season vegetables toward the storage cellar. Without hesitation she hurried over and lifted one basket before he could protest. Together they walked slowly across the courtyard. You do not have to help, the old man said softly. Evelyn smiled. Maybe not. But I wanted to. The gardener studied her for a long moment before giving the smallest nod. It was the first expression of genuine gratitude anyone in Black Hollow had offered her. As evening settled over the valley, horns echoed from the eastern watchtower. Every conversation stopped. Riders had arrived carrying royal banners embroidered with a silver wolf beneath a crescent moon. The messenger unrolled an elegant scroll before the gathered pack. By decree of Alpha King Lucian Ashford, every recognized pack leader was summoned to the Moon Palace in 5 days to attend the Royal Moon Assembly. Every eligible young woman of noble standing was to be presented before the throne. Excitement immediately swept through the courtyard. Dresses were discussed. Jewelry was polished. Ambitions awakened. Evelyn quietly returned to stacking firewood, believing the invitation had nothing to do with someone like her. She did not notice the royal messenger pause for just a brief moment before looking directly at her, as though making certain she was exactly where someone expected her to be. 5 mornings later, the entire Black Hollow pack buzzed with anticipation long before sunrise. Servants hurried across the courtyards carrying polished trunks, expensive gowns, embroidered cloaks, and polished boots while the smell of fresh bread and cedar smoke drifted through the crisp mountain air. Every conversation centered on one destination: the Moon Palace. Every young woman dreamed of catching the attention of Alpha King Lucian Ashford, whose wisdom and strength had united the Northern Territories after years of division. Some admired his courage. Others feared his silence. No one truly knew the man behind the crown, and perhaps that mystery made him even more legendary. Evelyn Carter quietly loaded luggage onto the wagons one piece at a time. She carefully secured each chest with sturdy rope, making certain nothing would shift during the long journey. The noble daughters barely noticed her existence as they compared shimmering dresses woven with silver thread and debated which colors would best reflect beneath the palace chandeliers. One laughed that moonlight made every gemstone sparkle brighter. Another insisted the king favored women who dressed with elegance instead of extravagance. Evelyn simply listened without speaking. Fashion had never been part of her world. Practical hands that washed clothes and gathered herbs rarely touched silk. Just before departure, pack leader Gideon Blackwood inspected the travelers with proud satisfaction. His gaze stopped on Evelyn. "You will come as well," he announced. Several women exchanged puzzled looks. "Not as a guest," Gideon added before anyone could ask. "You will carry trunks, prepare rooms, and remain out of sight unless instructed otherwise." Evelyn lowered her head respectfully. "Yes, sir." She climbed into the final supply wagon beside folded blankets, cooking utensils, and spare provisions. No one objected because no one considered her important enough to discuss. The caravan stretched nearly a quarter-mile as it departed through the eastern gates. Dozens of horses pulled decorated carriages while royal banners fluttered above them in the cool morning breeze. Their route crossed rolling hills, crystal streams, and forests where golden leaves shimmered beneath clear blue skies. Every few miles they passed travelers from other packs, all moving toward the same destination. Laughter echoed between the wagons as hopeful conversations filled the road. Some imagined becoming Luna. Others dreamed of earning powerful alliances for their families. Evelyn watched everything quietly from the back of the supply wagon, wondering what it must feel like to belong somewhere, because people genuinely wanted you there instead of because a contract demanded it. Near midday the caravan paused beside a broad river to rest the horses. While most travelers gathered beneath shaded trees to enjoy prepared meals, Evelyn wandered a short distance carrying a wooden bucket toward the water. As she knelt to fill it, she noticed an aging gray wolf lying beneath a willow tree with one front paw awkwardly raised. Unlike the others who walked past without a second glance, Evelyn slowly approached, keeping her movements calm so she would not frighten the animal. "You must have walked a very long way," she whispered. The old wolf watched her with unusually intelligent amber eyes but did not retreat. She carefully rinsed the paw with cool river water, and gently removed a small thorn lodged between the pads before wrapping it with a clean strip torn from the edge of her own apron. The wolf released a slow breath and leaned briefly into her hand before standing again with surprising dignity. Evelyn smiled softly. "There you are. Much better." A distant horn suddenly signaled that the caravan was moving again. She hurried back without looking behind her. Hidden beyond the willow branches, two royal guards remained completely silent. One glanced toward the healed wolf before lowering his head respectfully. The old gray animal stood motionless for another moment, watching Evelyn disappear among the wagons, then quietly turned toward the road leading to the Moon Palace, moving with a steady confidence that no ordinary wolf could ever possess. The Moon Palace appeared just before sunset, rising above the surrounding forest like something carved from moonlight itself. Towering white stone walls reflected the fading golden sky while silver banners danced in the evening breeze, each embroidered with the royal wolf beneath a glowing crescent moon. As the long procession entered through the enormous gates, conversations gradually faded into quiet admiration. Noble guests gazed upward at marble balconies, crystal windows, and elegant gardens where fountains shimmered beneath rows of ancient oak trees. Evelyn Carter had never imagined a place so beautiful could exist. Yet she reminded herself that she was not there to admire it. She climbed down from the supply wagon and immediately began unloading heavy trunks alongside the palace servants. While the daughters of powerful pack leaders disappeared into luxurious guest chambers, Evelyn carried dresses, polished shoes, and jewelry cases from one hallway to another until her arms ached. Even then, she smiled politely whenever someone thanked her, although very few did. As darkness settled outside, hundreds of glowing lanterns illuminated the grand hall where the royal moon assembly would soon begin. Music drifted softly through polished corridors while distinguished guests gathered beneath towering pillars decorated with silver ivy. Evelyn remained near the entrance organizing cloaks and helping elderly visitors find their assigned seats. She hoped to stay unnoticed. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. "You!" Pack leader Gideon Blackwood called loudly from across the hall. His voice echoed enough that nearby conversations paused. Evelyn immediately walked toward him with her head respectfully lowered. "Bring my ceremonial cloak." She hurried to retrieve it and carefully placed the expensive garment over his shoulders. Before she could step away, Gideon deliberately turned toward several neighboring pack leaders with a proud smile. "Allow me to introduce the finest bargain our pack has ever made." Curious eyes shifted toward Evelyn. One elder politely asked, "Who is she?" Gideon's smile widened. "Not who. What?" A few uncomfortable chuckles followed. He reached into the pocket of his formal coat and unfolded a neatly preserved parchment. This omega cost exactly 3 wagons of grain, 2 wagons of winter supplies, and 12 gold sovereigns. Every coin well spent. Someone nearby laughed a little louder. Another remarked that at least the trade seemed practical. Evelyn stood perfectly still, feeling dozens of strangers studying her as though she truly were another item listed on the agreement. She wanted to disappear into the polished marble floor beneath her feet. Instead, she quietly folded her trembling hands together, refusing to let tears appear in front of people who had already decided what she was worth. Gideon casually held up the parchment for everyone to see. Even her previous pack agreed she was expendable. More whispers spread across the hall. Some guests looked amused. Others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. No one challenged him. A palace servant accidentally brushed against Evelyn while carrying a silver tray and quickly apologized. Evelyn answered with the same gentle kindness she always offered. "It was only an accident. Please do not worry." The young servant blinked in surprise before hurrying away. At that exact moment, a deep ceremonial horn echoed through the grand hall. Every conversation stopped instantly. Royal guards in polished silver armor stepped into perfect formation along the crimson aisle leading toward the elevated throne. The towering entrance doors slowly opened, and every guest respectfully bowed their heads. Evelyn lowered hers as well, unable to see who entered. Yet before the silence settled completely, she felt something impossible to explain. It was the unmistakable feeling of being seen. Not as a servant. Not as a bargain. Not as someone traded away. Somewhere beyond the rows of kneeling nobles, a pair of calm silver eyes rested upon her with quiet recognition, and although she never dared to look up, Alpha King Lucian Ashford had already recognized the young woman who had gently cared for an old gray wolf beside a lonely river only days before. The grand hall remained wrapped in respectful silence as Alpha King Lucian Ashford took his place upon the silver throne carved from ancient white oak, its high back adorned with the emblem of the northern wolf. He acknowledged the assembled pack leaders with a calm nod before inviting everyone to rise. His presence was unlike the frightening stories whispered across distant territories. There was undeniable authority in every movement, yet it was carried with quiet restraint rather than intimidation. His silver eyes slowly traveled across the hall, observing every guest without hurry, until they paused for the briefest moment on Evelyn Carter before continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. The evening unfolded with graceful ceremony. Musicians played soft melodies while noble families were presented one after another. Young women curtsied with perfect posture, hoping to leave a memorable impression upon the king. Evelyn remained near the outer wall beside the palace servants, refilling crystal pitchers, arranging chairs, and making certain elderly guests were comfortable. She expected the night to pass without anyone noticing her again. During a short intermission, several guests wandered into the palace gardens to enjoy the cool evening air beneath thousands of glowing lanterns suspended between ancient trees. Evelyn carried an empty serving tray toward the kitchens when she heard the frightened cry of a small animal hidden among the flowering hedges. She immediately set the tray aside and followed the sound until she discovered a tiny silver wolf pup trembling beneath a stone bench. Its front paw had become tangled in decorative climbing vines, leaving the frightened little creature unable to free itself. Guests passed only a few yards away, too occupied with conversation to notice. Evelyn slowly knelt on the grass. "It is all right," she whispered gently. "I am not going to rush you." The pup watched her with wide golden eyes, shaking more from fear than discomfort. She carefully loosened each vine one strand at a time, speaking softly the entire time until the frightened animal finally relaxed enough to allow her hands near its paw. Once free, the little wolf leaned uncertainly against her knee. Evelyn smiled and stroked its soft fur. "There you are. Sometimes we all need someone patient enough to untangle what we cannot fix alone." The pup answered with a quiet little sound that almost resembled gratitude before happily circling around her feet. Evelyn laughed softly for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow. The sound was warm, genuine, and completely free of sadness. Neither she nor the curious pup realized that someone had been watching from the marble terrace overlooking the gardens. Alpha King Lucian Ashford stood beside the elderly gray wolf she had helped beside the river days earlier. The old wolf calmly sat at his side, its heeled paw resting comfortably against the polished stone. Lucian looked toward the animal with the faintest smile. "You chose well." The gray wolf quietly lowered its head as though acknowledging the compliment. A captain of the royal guard stepped beside the king and spoke in a careful voice. "Your Majesty, shall I have the young woman identified?" Lucian kept his eyes on Evelyn as she gently lifted the playful pup into her arms before setting it safely beside its anxious mother waiting beneath a nearby tree. "There is no need," he answered. "I already know exactly who she is." The captain looked surprised. The Omega from Black Hollow? Lucian gave a single thoughtful nod. The one everyone else refuses to see. As Evelyn picked up her forgotten serving tray and quietly returned toward the palace kitchens, she never once looked back. She believed she had simply helped another frightened creature because kindness asked nothing in return. She did not know that the most powerful man in the Northern Territories had just witnessed the same quiet compassion for the second time. And with every passing moment, the image others had tried to define with a trade agreement was being replaced by something far more valuable in the king's eyes. Long after the final notes of the evening orchestra faded into silence, the Moon Palace remained awake beneath the pale glow of countless lanterns. Servants quietly cleared crystal glasses from banquet tables while visiting nobles retired to luxurious guest suites, still whispering about the coming ceremony that would determine the future Luna of the Northern Territories. Evelyn Carter continued working beside the palace staff, folding table linens and carrying empty trays through quiet marble corridors until nearly midnight. She never complained about the long hours. In truth, keeping busy was easier than allowing herself to remember the humiliating laughter that had followed her earlier that evening. When the last tray had been returned to the kitchens, she slipped outside into the peaceful palace gardens, hoping only to enjoy a few moments beneath the stars before beginning another day. The cool night air carried the scent of roses and cedar as fountains softly rippled beneath the moonlight. Evelyn sat on a small stone bench beside a reflecting pool, and gently traced the smooth wooden wolf carving her mother had once placed in her hands as a little girl. "I hope I have made you proud," she whispered toward the silent sky. "I could not protect our home, but I can still choose kindness wherever I go." Unseen by her, someone else stood only a short distance away beneath the shadow of an ancient archway. Alpha King Lucian Ashford had not intended to interrupt her quiet moment. He simply listened without revealing his presence, his expression thoughtful rather than curious. After a long silence, he quietly turned and disappeared into the palace before she ever realized she had not been alone. Back inside the royal residence, Lucian entered a private council chamber where Captain Rowan Mercer and the elderly royal archivist Eleanor Whitmore were already waiting beside a large oak table covered with sealed records from every major pack. Lucian spoke only one sentence. "Bring me everything concerning Evelyn Carter." Neither advisor questioned the request. Eleanor carefully searched through decades of carefully preserved documents while Captain Mercer dispatched trusted royal messengers to verify every detail before dawn. Hours passed as parchment after parchment arrived beneath the royal seal. Shortly before sunrise, Eleanor finally placed the completed report before the king. Lucian read every page without interruption. He learned that Evelyn had never broken a single pack law. He learned that after losing her mother, she had spent years caring for elderly neighbors, abandoned wolf pups, and injured travelers without expecting payment. Witness after witness described the same quiet compassion. He also discovered the legal contract that had transferred her from Silver Ridge to Black Hollow in exchange for supplies after her stepfather declared her a burden rather than family. Lucian slowly lifted the final page, studying Harold Briggs's signature beneath the agreement. The room remained silent until Captain Mercer carefully spoke. "Everything was filed according to existing trade regulations, Your Majesty." Lucian closed the document with calm precision. "Lawful does not always mean honorable." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. There were no complaints from the previous pack because no one challenged the arrangement. Lucian looked toward the first rays of sunrise shining through the chamber windows. "That is precisely the problem." He rested one hand upon the trade contract for a long moment before speaking again. "A kingdom reveals its true character not by how it rewards the powerful, but by how it protects those with no one left to speak for them." Captain Mercer noticed something unusual in the king's expression. It was not anger. It was disappointment. Quiet, unwavering disappointment that people had mistaken another human life for property. Outside, the palace slowly awakened as bells announced the beginning of a new day. Guests prepared elegant clothing for the royal assembly, believing the ceremony would unfold exactly as tradition demanded. None of them realized that before the first noble entered the grand hall, Alpha King Lucian Ashford had already reached one silent conclusion. Before the sun set again, every person who had treated Evelyn Carter as a possession instead of a person would be forced to stand before the truth. Morning sunlight poured through the towering stained glass windows of the grand hall, scattering ribbons of silver and blue across the polished marble floor as representatives from every major pack gathered for the Royal Moon Assembly. The atmosphere carried a quiet excitement. Elegant gowns shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers while respected leaders proudly introduced their daughters, each believing this day might forever change the future of their family. Evelyn Carter remained near the back of the hall beside the palace servants, arranging fresh flowers along the banquet tables before quietly stepping aside where she would not distract from the ceremony. That was where she believed she belonged. At precisely 9 o'clock, the great silver doors opened, and Alpha King Lucian Ashford entered with calm confidence. Every conversation stopped. Every guest bowed. Lucian acknowledged the assembly before ascending the steps toward the royal throne. For several long moments he simply observed the crowded hall in complete silence. His composed expression revealed nothing, yet those who knew him understood that silence often carried greater weight than any speech. Finally he spoke. Before today's ceremony continues, there is one matter that must first be addressed. Curious whispers spread across the room. This was not part of the traditional proceedings. Lucian slowly descended from the throne instead of remaining above the gathering. His measured footsteps echoed across the marble as he walked directly toward pack leader Gideon Blackwood. "Lord Blackwood," he said evenly, "yesterday you displayed a document before this assembly." Gideon smiled confidently. "Yes, Your Majesty. A lawful transfer agreement." Lucian extended his hand. "Please show it to me." Without hesitation, Gideon proudly presented the folded parchment, believing the king merely wished to examine an example of proper pack administration. Lucian carefully unfolded the agreement and read every line once more. The hall remained so quiet that even the distant fountain outside could be heard through the open windows. When he finished reading, he lifted his eyes toward Gideon. "Is this the document by which Evelyn Carter was transferred into your possession?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Gideon answered. "Entirely legal." Lucian nodded once before looking beyond him. Evelyn Carter. She froze. Several servants gently stepped aside as every eye in the hall turned toward the quiet Omega standing near the flower arrangements. Unsure whether she had done something wrong, Evelyn slowly approached, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered. She stopped several feet from the king and quietly folded her hands together. "Yes, Your Majesty." Lucian held the parchment for a moment longer before asking a question no one expected. "When this agreement was signed, did anyone ask what you wanted?" Evelyn hesitated. The question itself felt unfamiliar. She searched for the right answer before quietly replying, "No, Your Majesty." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Lucian looked across the gathered nobles one by one. Did anyone ask whether she wished to leave her home? No voice answered. Did anyone ask whether she wished to become payment for another person's debt? Again no one spoke. The king carefully folded the agreement and placed it upon a nearby ceremonial table. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. A kingdom may establish many laws. Some preserve order. Some preserve prosperity. But when a law forgets the dignity of the people it claims to protect, it deserves to be questioned. Uneasy glances spread throughout the hall. Gideon's confidence slowly faded as he realized the gathering was no longer admiring the trade agreement. They were examining it with growing discomfort. Lucian turned toward Captain Rowan Mercer, who immediately stepped forward carrying another sealed document bearing the royal crest. The captain silently placed it into the king's hands. Lucian broke the seal and looked once more toward Evelyn before addressing the assembly. Today, this kingdom will correct something that should never have been accepted in the first place. The grand hall seemed to hold its breath as Alpha King Lucian Ashford slowly unrolled the royal decree bearing the silver seal of the Northern Crown. Every noble, every elder, and every visiting pack leader fixed their eyes upon him, waiting for words that none of them could predict. Lucian's voice carried clearly through the chamber. "By the authority entrusted to the crown, I hereby declare that no citizen of the Northern Territories shall ever again be transferred, exchanged, or valued as property through debt or contract. Any agreement that denies the dignity and free will of another person is null before this throne." A wave of astonished whispers swept across the hall. Gideon Blackwood's face lost every trace of confidence. The document he had proudly displayed only a day before had become meaningless in a single sentence. Lucian carefully folded the decree before turning toward Evelyn Carter. She remained motionless, uncertain whether she should step forward or remain where she stood. "Evelyn," he said gently. It was the first time anyone in Black Hollow had spoken her real name. Hearing it echoed through the grand hall felt almost unreal. She slowly approached until only a few feet separated them. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered her eyes. "Yes, Your Majesty." Lucian looked at her not with pity, but with quiet respect. "You believed no one saw your kindness." Evelyn remained silent. "Yet I watched you care for an old wolf beside the river without expecting thanks." The hall grew even quieter. "I watched you free a frightened wolf pup while others walked past without noticing." Several guests exchanged confused glances. The elderly gray wolf quietly entered the hall from a side doorway, walking with calm dignity until it stopped beside the king's throne. A ripple of recognition spread through the royal guard. The old companion gently rested its heeled paw upon the marble floor. Lucian smiled faintly before looking back toward Evelyn. "You offered compassion when no one was watching. That is not weakness. That is character." Evelyn's eyes slowly lifted for the first time. She could hardly believe the king had remembered such small moments. Lucian removed the long silver ceremonial cloak draped across his own shoulders, the traditional mantle reserved for the ruler of the Northern Territories during the Royal Moon Assembly. With careful hands he stepped forward and gently placed it around Evelyn's shoulders. A quiet gasp filled the chamber. No ruler had ever shared that symbol outside the royal family. The rich silver fabric settled around her simple gray dress, transforming the way the entire hall saw her in a single moment. Lucian then did something even more unexpected. Before every gathered pack, he lowered himself onto one knee, not as an act of surrender, but as a gesture of profound respect. Every noble stood frozen in disbelief. His voice remained calm and unwavering. "Only the moon may guide the heart of a king." He looked directly into Evelyn's tear-filled eyes. "And my heart has already found the woman whose kindness has never depended upon status, wealth, or recognition." The silence became almost sacred. "Evelyn Carter," he continued, "if you are willing, I ask you to stand beside me, not because you were traded, not because others judged your worth, but because I have seen the strength of your spirit. I ask you to become my Luna." Tears slipped quietly down Evelyn's cheeks as she struggled to find her voice. For the first time in many years they were not tears of humiliation. They were born from the overwhelming realization that someone had finally seen the person she had always tried to be. She gave a small, trembling smile and answered with complete sincerity, "Yes, Your Majesty. I would be honored." At that very moment every royal guard lowered one knee. One by one, the assembled pack leaders followed. Across the magnificent grand hall, hundreds of voices fell completely silent as the woman once measured against wagons of grain was welcomed with the honor reserved for the future Luna of the Northern Territories. 1 year later, the Moon Palace stood brighter than ever beneath the first full moon of autumn, its gardens overflowing with white roses planted throughout the kingdom in honor of Queen Evelyn, the Luna who had reminded an entire generation that compassion could become the greatest strength of all. Visitors arrived from every territory not simply to admire the royal court, but to witness the remarkable changes that had reshaped the Northern Territory since that unforgettable day in the Grand Hall. The old trade laws had disappeared forever, replaced by a royal charter declaring that every citizen, regardless of rank or birth, possessed equal dignity before the crown. Pack leaders who once measured success through wealth alone now found themselves expected to protect every member of their communities with fairness and respect. Gideon Blackwood had publicly acknowledged his failure as a leader and surrendered authority to a council chosen by his own pack, while Harold Briggs spent the rest of his days living quietly outside public office, remembered not for the agreement he had signed but for the lesson history refused to forget. Evelyn never celebrated their downfall. Whenever someone praised her for receiving justice, she gently answered that justice meant giving people the chance to choose something better tomorrow than they had chosen yesterday. That quiet wisdom spread from village to village until parents began repeating her words to their children. Every week, the palace gates opened to ordinary families seeking guidance, healing, or simply someone willing to listen. Evelyn insisted that no visitor should ever be turned away because of appearance, status, or circumstance. Palace servants often smiled as they watched their Luna greet every guest by name whenever possible, remembering details about their families and thanking them for making the journey. The grand throne room felt different now. It no longer inspired only awe. It welcomed hope. One peaceful afternoon, while walking through the royal gardens with Lucian Ashford, Evelyn noticed a young Omega girl standing nervously beside the entrance, clutching a worn blanket almost identical to the one Evelyn herself had carried when she first arrived at the Moon Palace. The child hesitated before quietly asking, "Your Majesty, is it true that you were once unwanted?" Several nearby adults lowered their eyes, embarrassed by the question, but Evelyn simply smiled with gentle warmth. She knelt until she was at the little girl's height and answered honestly, "There were people who believed they knew my worth. They were mistaken." The child looked confused. "How did you know they were wrong?" Evelyn carefully placed a hand over the girl's heart. "Because your value is never decided by the loudest voice in the room. It is revealed by the kindness you choose when no one is watching." Lucian stood nearby, listening with quiet admiration exactly as he had beside the river so many months before. He had once searched for a Luna worthy of wearing a crown. Instead, he had found someone who quietly taught an entire kingdom what a crown was truly meant to protect. As evening settled across the palace, the elderly gray wolf wandered peacefully through the gardens, followed by the now fully grown silver wolf that Evelyn had once rescued from tangled vines. They paused together beneath the ancient willow overlooking the reflecting pool where everything had begun to change. Lucian gently offered Evelyn his hand, and together they watched the moon rise above the northern territories they now served side by side. Around them, laughter from children echoed through the gardens, carried by a gentle autumn breeze that no longer whispered about fear or worthlessness, but about hope. And if anyone ever asked how a forgotten Omega became the most beloved Luna in the kingdom, the answer was always the same. She was never transformed by a crown. The crown simply revealed the extraordinary woman she had always been.